The Kronstadt Uprising 1921. When the revolution turned its guns on those who had made it? What happens when those once called the pride of the October Revolution rise up against the very government they sacrificed to create? How could a state born in the name of workers and peasants order artillery fire on the very people who brought it to power? And why, more than a century later, does Kronstadt 1921 remain a name the history of the Soviet Union prefers to avoid? To understand that, we must return to Russia in 1921. A country that had survived civil war, but was nearly exhausted by its own victory. The Russian Civil War had just ended. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Factories stood silent. The countryside was starving. The Bolshevik government, in its effort to maintain absolute control, implemented a harsh policy known as war communism. The state requisitioned grain from peasants, without compensation. Private trade was completely banned. Workers were subjected to military-style discipline. Any form of dissent could be labeled counter-revolutionary. On paper, these were temporary measures to defend the revolution. In reality, they made life unbearable for the very people in whose name it ruled. In Petrograd, the cradle of the October Revolution, workers began striking out of hunger. Bread rations were cut again and again. Protests erupted, not against the Tsar, but against the Soviet government itself. And just off the coast of Petrograd, on the ice-covered island of Kotlin, stood Kronstadt. Kronstadt was no ordinary place. It was a strategic naval base. And more importantly, a symbol of the revolution. Kronstadt sailors had been at the forefront of the uprisings of 1905. They had stood with the Bolsheviks in 1917. They were among the first to seize the Winter Palace. Lenin himself once called them the pride and glory of the Russian Revolution. But by 1921, those same people felt that the revolution had abandoned them. They did not demand the restoration of the old regime. They did not call for foreign intervention. They did not seek to overthrow the Soviets. Their slogan was, "Soviets without Bolsheviks." It was a dangerous slogan. Not because it was counter-revolutionary, but because it asked a question the authorities did not want to answer. Did the Soviets still belong to the people? Or had they become the property of a single party? In March 1921, Kronstadt sailors held a conference and adopted 15 demands. If read carefully, those demands were far from extreme. They called for free elections to the Soviets. They demanded freedom of speech for workers and other socialist parties. They demanded an end to forced grain requisitioning. They demanded the release of left-wing political prisoners. In other words, they were not calling for a new revolution. They wanted a return to the spirit of the old one. But in Moscow, those demands were seen very differently. To Lenin and Trotsky, Kronstadt was not merely a protest. It was a dangerous precedent. If Kronstadt were allowed to exist, other Soviets might follow. If the party's authority were challenged, the entire fragile state could collapse. In that atmosphere of paranoia, the Bolsheviks believed that behind Kronstadt stood the shadow of counter-revolution, of the White Army, of Western powers waiting for a chance to return to Russia. Trotsky issued a short and cold ultimatum: surrender, or be destroyed. There would be no negotiations. There would be no dialogue. March 1921 arrived, and winter still held the Gulf of Finland. The sea was frozen solid. And that ice became the road that led the Red Army to Kronstadt. From March 7 to March 17, tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers charged through snowstorms, marching across the ice, under artillery fire from men who had once been comrades. Artillery was deployed. Shells were fired directly at the naval base. The battle was fought not only with guns, but with a bitterness beyond words. In the end, Kronstadt fell. Thousands of sailors were executed. Thousands more were sent to labor camps. A small number escaped to Finland, carrying the memory that they had fought for an ideal that had turned against them. Immediately after Kronstadt was crushed, Lenin announced the new economic policy, the NEP. The state loosened economic control. Limited private trade was allowed. Forced grain requisitioning was ended. It was an implicit admission. War communism had failed. But the price of Kronstadt could not be undone. From that moment on, pluralism within the socialist movement came to an end. The Bolshevik Party became the sole holder of power. All dissent from the left was now labeled counter-revolutionary. Kronstadt was not just an uprising. It was the moment when the revolution turned its guns on those who had made it. And if we look at it fairly, no side in this story was entirely evil or entirely righteous. The Bolsheviks believed they were defending a fragile revolutionary state from collapse. The Kronstadt sailors believed they were saving the soul of the revolution from the corruption of power. Between those two beliefs were the sounds of artillery exploding on the ice. When a revolution begins with the promise of freedom, but ends with artillery firing on the very people who made it, the question is no longer who was right or wrong. It is, how far did power change the revolution itself?